Hello. He felt surprise flow from Forex, but spun around as his Corvidae senses flickered, with a jagged vision of the statue upon which the demagogue had hectored the refugees. There, two masked men in golden robes, with an Imperial Army issue rocket launcher primed and ready to fire. He held a warning as the gunner pressed the launch trigger. The rocket streaked towards Forex. The Iron Warrior had seen it coming. He braced and bent into the incoming ordnance with a defiant roar. The warhead impacted dead center on his shoulder guard, exploding on impact with a percussive hammer blow. Ariman threw an enclosing kind barrier around Forex. A storm of razored fragments engulfed the Iron Warrior, but remained trapped within Ariman's psychic shield. The two men bent to reload their weapon with a speed that spoke of professional training, but they had already taken the best shot they were ever going to get. Ariman pushed his thoughts into the eighth enumeration, the most warlike posture of his fellowship, and poured his psychic power into their mortal physiology. They screamed, clawing the flesh from their bones as superheated blood aerosoled from every pore in a stinking red mist. Skin slid like melted wax. Bones bent and snapped. Ottoman let the power of the great ocean bleed out, exhaling as his combat instincts sought fresh threats. He registered no more gunfire or screams of terror. Weeping and pain were all that remained. He blinked away, freeze frame after images of half remembered truths, a corollary to such reckless expenditure of power. A brother lost to a terrible curse. A pain so great his mind fled from its memory. A great and terrible God reaching deep inside him to push the horror into the deepest vault within his mind. Memories close to the surface, and yet so far out of reach. Repercussive pain settled in his marrow in confusion and shrouded Ariman's thoughts. His mind rebelled at being forced to hear such a burden. A scorched gauntlet steadied him as he swayed. "Thank you, brother," he said. His vision grayed at the edges, and he knew not which of his brothers aided him. "I have not wielded such power since Bezant." "How did you do all that?" asked Forex. The interior of Shere Mavath was not at all what Atharva had expected, though there had been hints of considerations beyond the practical in the outward design of the fortress. They had been mere testers for its interior. The spaces were artfully formed and as exquisitely detailed as the dragon palaces of Terra. Its walls were polished smooth as marble and lit with recessed lumen strips. Yet the interior's clean simplicity sacrificed nothing of its defensive nature. Every screw stair turned to the left as it descended, and every onward passageway was laced with blind murder holes and plenty of sally ports. Perturabo led them to a vaulted chamber deep in the heart of the mountain. A grand hall of gleaming marble, veined with gold. Hardwired servitors labored at the banks of cogators, and spectral veils of newspheric data shimmered before clicks of mechanicum adepts, conversing in the statico cadences of lingotechnis. 3 of its walls were hung with decorative tapestries, large enough to fly from the armored carapace of a Titanicus war engine. The 4th was inset with a wide oculus screen that put Atharva in the mind of the pics he had seen showing the bridge of the Imperator Sonarum. Towards the rear of the chamber, wide steps led to a raised mezzanine area where Perturabo had set his command table. Magnus followed his brother up to a space that had the feel of a workshop, the air redolent of hot metal, grease, and craft. Sheet-covered benches lined walls hung with a host of artificers' tools, and the purpose of a great many were not immediately apparent. 2 iron warriors stood at the command table in the center of that space, haptically shifting data manifests between glowing tags of starship designations. From the crimson stains in their auras, their discussions had been heated. They looked up as Perturabo arrived and stood to attention. Perturabo took in the details of the plotter table with a glance and gave a curt nod, indicating Magnus and his warriors should join him. The volume of data presented on the plotter table was bewildering. Loading rates, trip times, cargo capacities, fuel reserves, fleet rotations, population influx, food levels, water supply, billeting arrangements, and hundreds more variables that played into the evacuation equation. Even Atharva, who prided himself on his analytical nature and capacity for the unforgiving arithmetic of war, found himself struggling to process the ocean of information displayed. "My 2 senior warsmiths," said Perturabo, indicating the 2 iron warriors shifting the data, "Harcourt and Barbin Falk." To Atharva's eyes, the former had the look of a brawler, thickly waisted, and with the majority of his muscle mass layered over his shoulders. A flicker of red danced before Atharva's eyes, a Corvidae sense of bloody destiny. Falk, however, was finely balanced, and Atharva sensed he was a warrior who might achieve greatness. "Atharva, my senior Liberius, and Phocis Scar, one of my fellowship captains," said Magnus. "Librarius? You still think that is a good idea?" asked Perturabo. "I do," said Magnus, "and Sanguinius agrees with me." "Tread lightly, brother," said Perturabo. "What happened on Bezant traveled farther than you think. These are uncharted realms. Be sure you know what lies beneath." "I do. I will do as you advise, and temper my researches with caution," replied Magnus, and Atharva felt the lightest brush of psychic influence from his Primarch. So subtle, he was unsure if he'd felt it at all. "Now to business, brother. Tell me of the evacuation's progress. Are you on schedule?" Perturabo blinked and looked up at his brother's use of "you," but said nothing. If Magnus noticed this brief irritation, he chose not to acknowledge it. "Barely, and we have little margin for delays," said Perturabo, turning his attention to the plotter table once more. The Primarch called up the manifests and fleet registries for the Legion ships anchored within the upper stratosphere. Data streamed from every entry, a cascade of energy demands, orbital vectors, and cargo capacities. Your ships are burning fuel at a prodigious rate by coming so close to pull off Morningstar's gravity, noted Atharva. They are, agreed Falk. It's a necessary trade-off between fuel consumption and overall trip time for the transatmospheric vessels. Even a few tens of kilometers less of a round trip makes a considerable difference to the evacuation timetable. Perturabo looked up a host of schematics, spinning wireframe diagrams of various transorbital shuttle variants available to the evacuation effort. Leaving aside the Lux Ferrum, the typical capacity for the transorbital conveyors available to us in the region of 300 people. Our surface-to-orbit operations can clear around 200 launches every day, bearing approximately 65,000 people off-world. That gives us a baseline requirement of needing to run 30 days of constant service-to-orbit flights without interruption to get everyone off-world. And that's without factoring in flight time, air traffic bottlenecks, refueling, or ongoing maintenance. And it takes no consideration of offloading and unloading evacuees at the other end. Working at best case margins, my initial timetable demands 2 Terran months to complete operations. We shave some time off as efficiency scales up with repetition, but we'll be doing very well if we can get much below my initial estimate. And that, of course, assumes everyone cooperates and is ready to be moved off Morningstar at regular intervals. Magnus smiled. I see now why this world needs you. It needs us, brother, said Perturabo. Both our legions are required to make this work. My lord Perturabo, said Atharva. Might I make an observation? Of course, said Perturabo. You see a flaw? Atharva hesitated, well aware of how fluid the foundations were beneath him. Though he had been part of the Great Crusade for a few years only, Perturabo's fearsome reputation for logistical brilliance was already well known. Perhaps, he said. Well, spit it out. We're on tight enough timetable without having to stand on 15th Legion rituals. Atharva nodded and dismissed the rotating schematics of the transorbital shuttles with a swipe of his hand. He pulled up the fleet registries once more, highlighting each vessel's passenger capacity with haptic gestures. The 4th and 15th Legion fleets comprise enough civilian craft to accommodate between 40 and 60,000 evacuees per vessel. We have 31 such ships between us, meaning we have capacity for, on paper, 1.65 million people. I can do arithmetic, said Perturabo. What is your point? Even after all that has befallen it, Morningstar's most recent census puts its population at just over 2 million. Even by stretching supplies, space, and available time to breaking point, we cannot evacuate everyone from Morningstar. I am well aware of that, Atharva, said Perturabo. Sadly, not everyone will survive to reach orbit and safely. We've already seen civil disobedience, riots, and people who simply don't want to leave. Then a great many people are going to die. A lot of people end up dead anyway, no matter what we do. There's no way anyone can organize the mass evacuation of an entire planet without the loss of life. Why would anyone not want to leave a doomed world? Asked Fossis Scar. It makes no sense. Hathor Matt and others have reported instances of the populace refusing to relocate in the face of death, said Magnus, but I agree. It is vexing why arguments of logic and reason should be ignored. The Imperium is better off without such fools, said Fossis Scar. Why should we waste our time and energy trying to help those who would not help themselves. Prospero leaned over the plotting table, and Fossiskar recoiled from the flint in his gaze. When the Primarch spoke, it was with the measured tones of a disappointed teacher. For the same reason, I would not allow a child to pick flowers on the edge of a cliff, no matter how bright the blooms, said Prospero. For the same reason, I would not let you wander the minefields before this fortress without a 4th Legion map and the training to interpret it. We must put aside such childish ignorance and do what is right. Now, do you understand why we must help as many of Morningstar's people as we can? Yes, Lord Perturbo, said Fossiskar. I am in your debt for correcting my erroneous thinking. Atharva bit back his amusement. Fossiskar was a seasoned scholar, but rarely did he admit to being in need of instruction. Even now, in the face of the Primarch's rebuke, his aura betrayed a measured insolence. Magnus grinned and said, Fossiskar is at his best when dealing with absolutes. True and false, right and wrong. He excels at unlocking the structures of empirical formula, and he will never be a moral philosopher or grand debater. Perhaps not, but he's not the first to express such sentiments, said Prospero. I'll not have it said we left innocents to die when we could have done something to save them. You and I need to work together, brother. I need every one of your warriors tasked to this world's evacuation, not chasing relics and digging in the dust. One squad diverted to the preservation of knowledge will not affect your timetable, said Magnus. The secrets of this world are too precious to be so easily squandered. You really believe there is some ancient knowledge buried in Zokharin that will explain why Morningstar survived Old Night unscathed? I am certain of it, said Magnus. And anyone else, I would say such certainty was arrogant, sighed Prospero, letting the data on the plotter table dispense like smoke. When have I ever been wrong about such things, said Magnus. Never, admitted Prospero, stepping towards the sheet-covered workbenches at the perimeter of the mezzanine. But there is a first time for everything, and I need all your warriors on board. But here, I want to show you something. The Primarch pulled back a white sheet to reveal a haphazard arrangement of half-finished products. Contraptions of mysterious purpose and beautiful arrangements of gears and motors. This is my workshop, said Prospero. It is just as I expected, said Magnus, delightedly moving from bench to bench to examine the pieces lying around the edges of the workshop. He lifted a sheet of wax paper laid beside a partially completed model of a grand amphitheater. The Thaliccharon, said Magnus. You begun work on it? Not yet, said Prospero. Soon, when the crusade is done, and we have heroic tales aplenty to fill with song, then I'll build it. On the mountain, across from Father's palace. I will be there to see it unveiled, promised Magnus, and his enthusiasm for his brother's works was genuine and contagious. He and Prospero spoke as brothers who shared every memory from birth to this moment, yet had known each other for only a few short years. Magnus had once spoken of how he and Prospero had spent time together on Terra, recovering the relics of a long-dead polymath and unearthing arcana from the forgotten places of old Earth. Atharva had been thrilled to hear such tales, relishing every opportunity to learn more of his gene-sire. The obvious love between these godlike warriors filled the workspace with a swelling feeling of confraternity, a bond of brotherhood that could never be broken. "This will be of interest to you, brother," said Perturabo, holding out a complex arrangement of curved metal, winding mechanisms, and adjustable lenses. "I made a replica of the Antithera, just like you'd asked." To see so delicate a mechanism in Perturabo's hands seemed incongruous, as most apparatus bearing the stamp of the Iron Warriors that Atharva had seen, save for those within his chamber, had been brutally functional. "Does it work?" "I'm not entirely sure," answered Perturabo. "You never really explained its intention, or how exactly it was designed to function." "You've built it," said Magnus. "What do you think it does?" "I believe it to be some form of navigational instrument," said Perturabo, lifting the device to look through one of its eyepieces. "It has the look of a sextant once used by seafarers, but with infinitely more dimensions to its operations. What manner of ocean would you be navigating to require such a device?" "The great ocean," said Magnus. "It allows even those with our gifts to perceive the realm beyond." Perturabo nodded and set down the device. "I suspected as much," he said with a sigh, turning to lift something heavy from another part of his workbench. "You remember what our father told us in the Hall of Lang, when he spoke of the warp and the danger of looking too deeply into its heart?" "I do," said Magnus. "But this has nothing to do with that." "It has everything to do with that, as well you know. But we will speak of this later." Perturabo's arm swung around and he smashed the delicate mechanisms with a heavy hammer. The metal of the device buckled and split, the precision ground lenses shattering into 1,000 fragments. "Brother, no!" replied Magnus, as the pieces fell to the floor. "Why?" Perturabo replaced the hammer on his workbench and said, "Because I will play no part in aiding you and delving into things you have been told to leave well alone. Our father knows more than us. He has seen further than us. And if he tells us there are regions of the warp into which even he does not dare look, then we are beholden to accept that." Magnus stared at the ruined device in disbelief. Such a piece was the work of a master, a treasure that ought to have been held up as the epitome of the craftsman's art. Atharva saw Magnus's aura darken, like blood in the water. "Knowing what you suspected, you could have destroyed it at any time after its completion," said Magnus, with cold and controlled anger. "But you waited until I was here to see you do it. Why?" "Because you needed to see it destroyed to truly understand." Magnus let out a breath. "You have a cruel streak in you, brother," he said. "Perhaps," conceded Perturabo. "But sometimes cruelty is the only way to make a point so clearly that no one can ever mistake its intent." The sky over Atar's hab towers burned with clashing magnetics. Hostile stellar radiation was stripping away the planet's atmosphere shield, transforming the night into a scintillated borealis of reflected light and billowing storm clouds. Twisted starlight bathed the city with end of day's radiance. The highways and mass conveyance routes out of the city were jammed with every form of transport imaginable as the Tar's people fled to Kalania. The organization of the evacuation was under the aegis of Conrad Varga's Gruber National Guard, but their breathtaking inefficiency had jammed every highway and transit route for tens of kilometers. Mechanicum provosts were attempting to unravel the gridlock, but it was taking time the citizens of Atar did not have. Lightning stabbed the city with fiery lances over and over again, and its industrial sectors were Promethean hell pits of toxic fumes and chemical infernos. Beautiful, is it not? Said Magnus Tankarix, watching the city die from the safety of his gloss-red Tyrannus squadron to the north of Atar. Major Anton Orlov bit back a bitter response and took a calming breath that tasted of filsaline, plastic, and burning fuel silos. He wanted to be angry at the Mechanicum Adept's singular lack of empathy for the people of Morningstar, but expecting emotion from Machine Priest was an exercise in futility. Instead, Orlov said, "It's hard to think of something that's destroying my world as beautiful. The imminent demise of Morningstar is regrettable, of course," said Tankarix, without looking up from the array of unfolded workstations integral to the structure of Tyros. "But that does not alter the aesthetics of the store, Major Orlov, nor the value of the data that will allow us to lessen our current meteorological uncertainty." The Magos was, physiologically at best, less chimeric than many of his brethren. His face was entirely flesh, yet the back of his skull was a bulbous dome of mimetic engines, cognitive boosters, and coolant pipes. Every interaction Orlov had with Tankarix reinforced the feeling that any humanity the adept displayed was a veneer, a mask that enabled him to interact with unaugmented mortals. A machine heart beat within his body, as did a ghoulish appreciation for beauty and devastation. Orlov knew it was pointless to argue with Tankarix, but couldn't help himself. Atar was once a prosperous city of seaborne trade from all over Morningstar, he said, pointing to a wind-swept headland overlooking the bay. "I grew up here. When I was young, I used to watch the ships coming in at night from just over there. It was mesmerizing to watch the aerial tugs guide the ships in, their prows ablaze with stab lights and collision markers. I used to imagine they were starships, and that I was floating in the void, that I was absolutely alone and free. When I was drafted into the Red Dragons, I missed that view. But any time I had leave, I'd come back here and watch the ships rolling in and out. It gave me a sense of peace and belonging, a sense that as long as the ships kept coming and going, all would be well. Do you understand?" Orlov looked over at Tankarix, but the Mangos was intent on the cascades of information scrolling down Tyros' myriad data slates. His sentiment was falling on deaf ears, and he turned his gaze instead to the city's coastline. Far distant tectonic movement and hydrovolcanoes had split the ocean bedrock, and the sea had retreated thousands of kilometers. Beyond the flames, engulfing the lower reaches of the city, Atar's vast docks were now towering white cliffs. Atar's once mighty fleet of oceanic harvesters Container vessels and material conveyors lay toppled onto their sides, stranded like beached leviathans. All that is gone now, he said, forever. There are other worlds not dissimilar to this one, said Tankerix, examining a brass-rimmed slate with a jumping needle with a look of puzzlement. He tapped a metallic finger against the glass, but the needle did not steady, and yet more joined in its frantic spiking. But this one was mine, said Orlov, and I will mourn it. Tankerix did not answer, too intent on the vexation his instruments were causing. Orlov saw the adept's eyes widen, which was as close to the exclamation as they ever came. What's the matter? Said Orlov. Incoming magnitude readings, said Tankerix, beyond the capacity of my instrumentation to measure. What does it mean? It suggests an imminent seismic event of catastrophic power. Seismic event? You mean earthquake? Yes, Major Orlov. An earthquake, said Tankerix. One of unprecedented magnitude, and with an epicenter of only a few kilometers from where we stand. On the Saya, protect us. Sour bile churned in Orlov's belly. When? Right now, said Tankerix. As grinding rock and splintering stone twisted the ground, and the thrumming brass notes split the air. The headland where Orlov watched the ships coming and going sheared away, obliterated in a thunderous avalanche. What had once been the seabed ripped wide open, and the burning sectors of Atar tumbled into a hellish, fiery chasm. Morningstar shrugged.